Hello, welcome to Dungeoneer's Pack, a channel bringing you player-focused discussions and character guides for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. My name is Josh, thank you for watching. Beginning in 2017, Wizards of the Coast has tried to bring Psionics into 5th edition D&D through Unearthed Arcana. Now in 2020, Wizards of the Coast appears to be stepping away from a core Psionic class in favor of implementing Psionic mechanics as subclasses for the various classes in the game. In this video, I'm going to go over the community's expectation for Psionics, why Psionics in its many forms in 5e hasn't been working, my opinion on what Wizards can do to fix Psionics, my own ideas on what a main Psion class would look like, and finally, my opinion on whether 5th edition needs a core Psionic class. With that said, let's get started. The vocal online D&D community opinions on Psionics has been a mixed bag. Some are upset that Wizards is stepping away from a core class design, upset with the Psionic Wizard being dropped, or upset that we are now testing out a dice mechanic in lieu of a point system. Others, on the other hand, like the new dice mechanics and are receptive of Psionics being added to the game through the subclass system instead of a core class. There is a consensus on what the community at large wants out of Psionics for the current edition, and they are as follows. If there is a new Psion class, it has to be intelligence-based, and in concern of its class fantasy, the class needs to reflect the Psion unleashing their abilities through the power of their own will. That power is internal, similar to a sorcerer, but studied and developed like a monk. In regards to Psionics as a mechanic, we want a core resource system, either a point or dice system that can also be spread throughout subclasses. With our expectations set, let's take a look at what's currently happening with Psionics and what isn't resonating with the community. First up, we're looking at the mechanics. The Mystic class was Wizards' first attempt at a new Psion class. The Mystic's problem was that it was too broad and powerful. The Mystic allowed a player to encompass many roles in the party at once. Normally, when a class is a jack of all trades, they are expected to be decent in many roles, but never better than a class that specializes in that role. The Mystic not only was outshining other classes at what they did, they were able to do this to multiple classes at once. While some players may have enjoyed that high power level, it actually hurt the class because it doesn't allow them to specialize in a role to be an active team member in the party. The Mystic allowed a character to be the party. Next, Psionic mechanics have been ill-defined. The Mystic brought back psi points from previous editions as a resource to spend on abilities. This was familiar to longtime players and similar enough to key or meta magic points that current D&D players could grasp. Psi points were dropped alongside the Mystic when Wizards switched over their design to Psionics as subclasses. Originally, the Psionic subclasses had no unifying mechanic to rely on. Instead, subclasses had their own abilities that reflected psychic flavor. Psionics at this point also appeared in the form of spells that classes can cast. By doing this made Psionics another power source for spellcasting instead of making it its own system. Psionic abilities as spells is a simple fix, but doesn't resonate with some members of the community. There is an idea that Psionics should be its own system that is outside the current spellcasting rules. This belief isn't universally shared by the community, but it's something to mention. The problem that Psionics as spells presents is how undefined the source of Psionic power is within the current meta lore of D&D. There are also expectations being carried over from previous editions that are butting heads with the current design philosophy of the game. Unfortunately, for those against Psionics as spells, the recent release saw Wizards double down on Psionics as spells but remove the Wizard subclass as a Psion class stand-in. This time, they did introduce a unifying mechanic in the form of psi dice. Psi dice works like this. We start off with a d6, we roll it when we expend it, we add the number rolled to whatever ability being used. If we roll the max number on the dice shrinks to a dice size lower, but if you roll a 1 on that dice, instead, the dice size goes up a size, but never exceeding the starting dice size. In my opinion, psi dice are a bit clunky. It forces the player to have to keep track of a constantly shifting resource, while other classes have a point-based form of resource management that are all relatively functioning the same. The psi die's only limit of use is dependent entirely on probability. That probability doesn't sit well with me as it doesn't match my expectation of how the mechanics relates to the class fantasy. I understand the intended flavor was the higher low rolls represents the expending or reservation of energy being used on an ability, but the fact it is left up to chance takes away from the idea that a Psion or Mystic has trained to control these powers. While in various pop culture media, there are characters with psychic or psychic-like abilities that do lose control, much of the themes behind Psionics is about willpower and self-control. Speaking of class fantasy, from a flavor standpoint, the Psion story origin is a combination of the sorcerer, monk, and druid. The power source is internal like a sorcerer, the abilities are studied like a monk, and the character is often reclusive like a druid. The problem is that some elements of the character fantasy can be covered through various systems in the game currently. We can take a base class and attach a background that suits the origin. The only thing really holding the class fantasy back is that there's a lack of mechanics supporting the flavor for abilities. Individual elements are there, but there isn't a chassis binding them together in a cohesive package. As previously stated, Psionics in its current form is struggling to convey the idea of making stuff happen with the power of your will. Another issue is where the idea of Psionics fits in a fantasy-based game. The inspiration for Psionics is based in sci-fi. The two genres have rules on how superhuman abilities work. When science fiction and fantasy combine, they usually produce a result like the Artificer, which by all means is a magic scientist. Or for a pop culture reference, the Jedi and Sith in Star Wars. But each of these ideas has a cohesive set of rules that fits them into their narrative. Some in the community want Psionics to retain its sci-fi narrative while functioning similar but different from magic. In my opinion, Psionics either needs to function as its own system, working like other classes' resource mechanics, or if it needs to function like spellcasting, it needs to just be embraced that Psionics is another form of magic casted through a different expression. So how does Wizards go about fixing Psionics? Psionics needs a clear identity. Wizards needs to define the Psion source of power and how it interacts with other forms of power in D&D, narratively and mechanically in this edition. There needs to be a clear choice between Psionics being its own system, or they need to embrace it as another form of spellcasting and have it interact with a current spellcasting system. I know this idea will upset some, but this is really for balance issues. A class cannot have an expansive spell list similar to a wizard, yet not have its abilities not be interactable. They need to introduce a core mechanic that can be slotted into subclasses if Wizards wants to continue to introduce Psionics in this manner. Currently, the side-eye is a step in this direction, even if it's not my favorite idea. If Wizards were to give a Psion class another try, they need to limit its abilities and define its party role. The abilities from Mystic were way too broad, allowing them to be good at everything. For fun, here's how I would approach creating a Psion class. It would be intelligence-based. All intelligence-based classes fit the out-of-combat role of troubleshooter by design. Wizards use their spells and knowledge skills to solve problems, while artificers use a combination of tool proficiencies, magic items, and spells to solve problems. Psions could use telekinetics to solve physical problems, and telepathy to solve social challenges. For the core class mechanics, I would use a point-based resource that can be expended to do abilities the core class can do, similar to how Ki works for monks. Alongside the point system, I would bring back disciplines for the Mystic, but not as expansive in order to fit the class into its party role. Discipline is a concentration-based ability, has an always-on effect when concentrated on, but what I would change is when spending points to use an ability, an additional effect is added to that ability based on what discipline is being concentrated on at that time. Disciplines would be like Warlock invocations, but only one can be active at any given time due to the concentration rules, and some may be locked behind level or subclass restrictions. Another idea I would introduce through class progression is an ability that gives the feeling of being able to push yourself beyond the limit at the expense of your own health. I don't know exactly how I would do this, but it's something that is integral to the class fantasy. When it comes to subclasses for my idea of Psion, the subclasses are to fulfill a niche in Psionic character fantasy. We can accomplish this by giving the subclasses more point spending abilities that can help fill its role in the party. Possibly, they can get access to subclass specific disciplines as well. Taking the ideas from my Psion, this is how I would apply it to subclasses for other classes. Organize the disciplines by categories, similar to schools of magic. Subclasses would only get access to one or two categories of disciplines to choose as they level. They would still use the point resource system as the Psion class, and would have access to some of the Psion's point spending abilities that would suit the subclass. Without a question, we want Psionics in D&D, but do we need a Psion class in 5th edition? Psionics has such a long history with the game, it's hard to imagine this edition would go without Psionics in some form. With Wizards' decision to step back from designing a core class, it signals that to them, the Psion does not have a big enough design space that will make it vastly different from spellcasters in the system. I do believe 5th edition needs Psionics, but only if it relied on its own mechanics. Psionic fills in the character concepts not fully supported in the system. Psionic warriors that mix martial skill with mental prowess, telekinetics that can manipulate objects with their mind, and the telepath that will be used to communicate and troubleshoot. But what about a Psion class? Yes, there should be a main Psionic-based class. There is room for another intelligence-based class that is an eccentric hero who has learned to harness a power within and perform amazing feats through their own willpower. Drawing inspiration from various pop culture media, a Psionic could play a supportive telekinetic controller or a Psionic blaster role in combat while being a telepathic troubleshooter out of combat. The various subclasses under a Psion class could expand on these three identities. This would put it in the same space as a wizard, but that's okay. Even if they share the same role space, the Psion would differentiate itself with how it goes about approaching its solution to challenges. Currently, elements of a Psion are spread throughout the game for players, but none of them are in a cohesive package. When you combine some of those elements to play a class reflavored as a Psion, there isn't enough abilities to really feel Psionic, and often you have to take up other abilities to fill in gaps and they just don't fit. With that said, I want to hear from you. I want to know what you think about the current state of Psionics in 5th edition. How would you approach fixing Psionics? Or do you like the current direction Wizards is taking? Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to know when new videos are up. Alright, I'm out of here. Have a good one.